We were talking about Blazing Saddles. That movie, I really think, in a lot of ways, changed the game. That's how it felt to me when I watched it at the time. Everyone thought it's the funniest movie we've ever seen.
Blazing Saddles gave audiences many lines they could never forget. But its most talked about line was never meant to amuse it. Reach the final cut. In 1974, Mel Brooks had already fought Warner Brothers over racial jokes, fart sounds, and scenes executives thought could destroy the movie. Still, one bedroom joke made even him nervous. It was filmed. It got laughs. Then, Brooks watched it again and suddenly pulled it out himself. So, what music was hiding inside that line? And why did the wildest comedy of its time finally decide one joke had gone too far? When Blazing Saddles arrived on February 7, 1974, it stepped into a Hollywood still making serious westerns music, and turned the whole genre inside out. Warner Brothers was still releasing straight-faced frontier stories. Yet, here came a film that opened with a black railroad worker becoming sheriff of an all-white town called Rock Ridge. It cost about $2.6 million, ran just over an hour and a half, and still managed to hit nerves that major studios had avoided for years. The movie packed racial slurs, crude jokes, and open ridicule of white bigotry into one wide-release comedy. Some critics in 1974 called it vulgar and offensive. Yet, audiences showed up in huge numbers and made it the highest-grossing Western ever. That response said, "Music, a lot." Viewers were ready to laugh at America's racism long before Hollywood felt comfortable doing it. A huge part of that force came from the writing room. The screenplay officially carried 5 names: Mel Brooks, Andrew Bergman, Norman Steinberg, Alan Yuger, and Richard Pryor. Behind those credits was a room full of people trying to push every joke as far as it could go. Bergman's earliest draft from 1971 was called Tex X, a sharp Malcolm X joke, built around the idea of a black sheriff in the West. Steinberg had practiced law. Ugger had worked as a dentist. Brooks pulled them into a creative mess where almost nothing was treated as off-limits. That spirit shaped the movie from the start. Brooks later joked that he hired Richard Pryor so they could use the ugliest racial language possible and pin the blame on him. And that joke reveals something important about the process. The writers were not using taboo words casually. They were treating them like live wires that could expose the stupidity and poison of racism if handled in the right way. Pryor, in particular, pushed hard on that point. Early drafts reportedly used the N-word far more often than the finished film. He wanted the audience to feel worn down by it. He believed that if the redneck characters kept repeating it again and again, the word would stop feeling like a studio shock tactic and start sounding like what it really was: ugly, empty, and pathetic. That mattered because Bart's music dignity depended on it. The worse the town sounded, the stronger his presence became. In that sense, the language was part of the pressure building around him. By the time Bart rises above it, victory lands harder. Even with that sharp idea underneath the comedy, the movie nearly collapsed before cameras even rolled. Warner Brothers got nervous early. Mel Brooks later remembered studio notes that demanded major changes. They wanted the fart scene removed. They wanted racial and ethnic jokes cut. They wanted the whole thing toned down if he expected a release. At one point, there was even serious anxiety about who would play Sheriff Bart. Richard Pryor had been part of the creative core, and the idea of casting him in the role frightened the studio because of both his reputation and the film's racial content. Brooks eventually cast Cleavon Little, but the larger problems stayed the same. The people financing the movie could already feel how dangerous it was. Brooks later admitted that when he first showed them the script, he genuinely thought the film might never get made. That struggle over what could stay in the movie helps explain why one particular scene feels so sharp. The bedroom sequence with Lily Von Stupp lives right on that line. Her flirtation plays with a racist sexual stereotype about black men, but the joke does not settle there. It twists music, that fantasy, into something ridiculous and uncomfortable, which is exactly music, why it stands out. The scene does more than chase a laugh. It exposes the weirdness hiding inside white desire, fear, and projection. In a film already fighting to keep bodily humor and racial language intact, that innuendo somehow survived. Its survival says a lot about how carefully the movie moved along the edge of censorship while still finding ways to sting. Music. That same edge shaped the famous Lost line from the seduction scene. During the writing and rewriting of the film in 1973 and 1974, Brooks and his team followed one guiding instinct. Get as close to the studio limit as possible, then see if one more step could still fit. The line, "You're sucking on my arm," came out of that approach. Brooks wanted a joke that would turn the audience's expectation around in one instant. The setup encouraged viewers to assume something explicit was happening. The line yanked that assumption into absurd territory. It was bold, filthy in implication, and funny precisely because it never stated the act outright. The shock came from what the audience thought it understood, and the joke snapped that thought in half. Lily Von Stupp herself was built with that same kind of deliberate exaggeration. Brooks shaped her as a parody of Marlene Dietrich, especially the glamorous and smoky persona Dietrich carried in films like Morocco and Destry Rides Again. He created the role for Madeline Kahn and encouraged her to stretch every sensual trait until it became funny. The slow delivery, the heavy eyelids, the drawn-out singing, the exaggerated mystery, all of it was part of the design. Her number, "I'm Tired," turns glamour into a joke without ever letting the audience forget how polished she looks. That balance is what makes the character work. She enters as a fantasy and slowly reveals herself as a comic performance made of pure excess. The bedroom scene was built with just as much care. Brooks structured it like an old darkroom farce, the kind of routine that depended less on what the audience saw and more on what they imagined. The lighting stayed dim. Movement happened off-screen or at the edge of view. Sound and dialogue carried the moment. That choice gave the scene its power. By withholding the image, the film invited the audience to fill in the blank themselves. In 1974, that was also a practical way to slip past censorship. What could not be shown directly could still be heard, guessed at, and felt. Brooks later explained that this made the joke stronger. Imagination did more work than any explicit image could have done. In Brooks's own telling, the original version of the scene went even further. Lily praises Bart's incredible size while the action stays off camera, and Bart responds with a deadpan line, "You're sucking on my arm." The whole joke depends on misdirection. Lily sounds confident. The audience thinks it knows what is happening. Then the correction lands, and the entire image collapses into nonsense. Brooks said the line was fully shot and appeared in early edits before release. Preview audiences reacted strongly, which is not surprising. The movie was already controversial, and that line pushed into a different kind of shock. It was not only crude, it was startlingly intimate in the way it used the viewer's assumption against them. What makes the joke memorable is how efficiently it works. It lets implication do the heavy lifting. It waits until the audience settles into one expectation. Then it flips the meaning with perfect timing. Music. Brooks understood something important about viewers in 1974. Their minds were already moving ahead of the screen. The joke made use of that. It trusted the audience to imagine the scene for themselves. Then punished that confidence with a ridiculous reveal. Because of that, the laugh feels personal. The viewer becomes part of the mechanism. Then comes the strangest twist in the story. For all the chaos around Blazing Saddles, Mel Brooks later said he cut exactly one joke from the film, and it was that line. He told Conan O'Brien in 2012 that he watched it in the editing room, got scared, and felt that he had gone a little too far. What makes that decision so fascinating is the context around it. This was a filmmaker who had already built a 1974 studio movie music around frontier racism, Nazi jokes and other works, and language that most mainstream films would never touch. Yet, this was the moment that made him pull back. Even Brooks admitted he could not fully explain why it crossed the line for him. That choice becomes even more striking when you look at everything he kept. The film still reached theaters with the full campfire fart scene intact. It still had punching a horse. It still carried a flood of slurs aimed at Black, Native American, Chinese, Jewish, and gay characters. Warner Brothers worried about the rating. Executives feared the mix of vulgarity, racial language, and broad violence might push the film too far. Brooks refused to soften the major shocks because he saw their purpose clearly. The villains used hateful language, and the movie made them look foolish for it. That mattered to him. The racism stayed visible because mocking it honestly required that ugliness to be seen. At the same time, Brooks had every reason to be careful. He later admitted that before the film opened, he feared violent backlash. He imagined angry audiences rejecting it completely. He worried that people would riot over jokes about black people, Jewish people, Chinese people, and others. Studio executives were already furious over the fart sequence and deeply uneasy about the flamboyant energy of the French mistake, music, ending. They kept warning him that he was crossing lines. In that climate, one more explicit bedroom gag may have felt different. Sheriff Bart was not just another character in music, a joke machine. He was the heroic center of the film, and Brooks cared about protecting that. Music. That is why the missing line matters. It was not removed by studio demand. It was not blocked by censors. It was not killed by protesters. It disappeared because Mel Brooks decided privately in the editing room that the scene worked better without it. In a movie famous for how much it got away with, the strongest act of censorship came from the filmmaker himself. That reveals something worth remembering about Blazing Saddles. Its power did not come from chaos alone. Brooks was constantly measuring the effect of every joke. He wanted the film to provoke, sting, and explode at the right moments. Yet, he also knew that comedy depends on control. Even in a movie built on risk, somebody still had to decide where the edge really was. That battle had already shown up earlier in a bigger way. After seeing a rough cut, Warner Brothers executives reportedly sent Brooks a massive memo of demanded cuts, often described later as a list running to 26 pages. Their requests targeted nearly everything that gave the film its identity. They wanted music, the fart scene gone. They wanted racial jokes removed. They objected to moments involving violence toward an old woman and a horse. According to Brooks, if he had followed those instructions, the movie would have been music, stripped down to almost nothing. He joked that it would have run about 14 minutes. The exaggeration carries a truth. The studio was not trying to trim the edges. Music. It was trying to remove the very material that made the film what it was. Brooks's response became part of movie legend when Warner turned those objections into a formal list of required cuts and called him into a meeting. Later accounts say he walked in, took the packet, crossed the room, and dropped it into the trash. Then he made it clear that he would not surrender the film. Lawyers got involved. The studio pressed him. Brooks brought in his own legal support and refused music to give ground. For several days, the fight dragged on while the release loomed. The conflict only eased when the film played strongly with audiences inside the studio, proving that the very material executives feared was exactly what made it work. And that is what makes the missing arm line so fascinating in the end. Brooks' music fought the studio over racial language, crude sound effects, cartoon violence, and a finale that tears through the wall of the movie itself. He risked his career to keep those choices alive. Yet, when he sat alone with that one-bedroom joke, he pulled back. That moment tells you something deeper about the film's creation. Blazing Saddles was never careless. It was reckless in appearance and precise underneath. Brooks knew how much pressure the movie could hold. He knew how far it could bend before something important snapped. The joke about the arm simply landed on the far side of that instinct. Years later, Brooks would say that Blazing Saddles could never be made today. And people often quote that as a statement about changing culture. There is truth in it. But the history of the film shows something more interesting. The line was always thin. It was thin in 1974. Music. It was thin in the writing room. It was thin inside Warner Brothers. It was thin in the editing room. That is what gives the film its strange electricity. Every great moment feels like it survived a fight. Every scene carries the sense that someone somewhere thought it had gone too far. Then the movie plays and the music result feels alive because it is full of those decisions. One reason that insult from music Blazing Saddles still gets quoted so often is the way it lands. The moment feels easy and natural, almost like Gene Wilder found something extra in the scene while the camera was rolling. In the finished version, the Waco Kid gently describes the people of Rock Ridge as simple farmers and people of the land. And then he adds that last dry little sting. You know, morons. It hits because it feels so calm. Then it turns sharp in an instant. That little turn gives the joke its life. And it also makes the line feel looser than the rest of the speech. That feeling fits the way Mel Brooks made the movie in the first place. Blazing Saddles was built in a messy, fast, creative storm. The script passed through several writers, and the jokes kept changing as they moved around the room. One person would shape a line, then somebody else would twist it. Then another writer would throw in something new. By the end, the script was less a fixed document and more a launch point. Brooks liked it that way. He treated the page as a base and kept pushing for more once the cast reached the set. He told actors to use the script, then add whatever came into their heads. If the crew started fighting laughter, that was a good sign. It meant the movie was alive. That is part of why the morons line grew into a legend. Modern pop culture lists love to place it beside other famous ad-libs from film history, and that has only made the story bigger. Some write-ups present it like a totally improvised one-liner. Others repeat the full speech as though every word had always been in the script. That confusion only helps the myth. People keep circling the same question and never fully settle it. Was the line written from the start, partly shaped on the day, or simply improved by Wilder's timing? The answer matters less now than the effect. What stayed behind was the feeling that one small addition changed the scene forever. That same loose energy also explains why the film's mistakes became part of its charm. Over time, fans' music began spotting continuity slips and small errors all through Blazing Saddles. A chain changes position between shots. Shaving cream appears, disappears, then returns. Music. A man gets knocked down in one moment and then seems to vanish in the next crowd shot. In another movie, those things might feel distracting. Here, they almost blend into the joke. The pace is so wild and the tone is so reckless that even the mistakes seem like they belong. They do not stop the film. They feed it. When all of that is placed together, the bigger reason the movie still feels dangerous becomes easier to see. Its best moments came from a mix of planned comedy, sudden invention, and plain accident. A line may have been sharpened on the spot. A crude gag may have survived a fight with the studio. A continuity slip may have stayed in because everybody was laughing too hard to care. That kind of chaos usually gets cleaned up. In Blazing Saddles, it stayed on the screen. That is why the film still feels raw. It does not move like something polished to death. It moves like something barely contained. That same sense of chaos also shaped the stories around the film after release. Almost as soon as Blazing Saddles arrived in 1974, people started talking about what was missing from it. Warner Brothers had already pushed Mel Brooks through test screenings and a hard studio notes process. There were pages music of demanded cuts, and the pressure was serious enough that huge parts of the movie could have been removed if Brooks had obeyed. He did not. He tossed those notes aside and kept fighting for the film he wanted. Even so, longer preview versions had existed before the final cut locked in. Those early versions reportedly, music, contained extra racial jokes, extended slapstick, and even a bizarre Hitler sequence that took the story somewhere even stranger than the finished movie ever did. That missing Hitler material became one of the strangest legends attached to the film. Brooks reportedly shot a full musical sequence where Hitler arrived in the Old West and tried to recruit cowboys into the Third Reich through song and performance. It sounds unreal now, yet it was real enough to be filmed. Then test audiences watched it and the energy in the room died. The shift was too much. People who had been following a Western spoof filled with fart jokes, music, and satire suddenly found themselves in an entirely different movie. Brooks later admitted it was too insane, even for him, so the sequence was cut. Over time, almost all of it vanished. What remains is mostly memory, rumor, and a trace here and there that tells us it once existed. That pattern repeats all through the film's afterlife. Some material survives in a script draft. Some survives in a still photo. Some lingers only because somebody mentioned it in an interview years later. Now and then a television version would include a tiny extra bit while removing something more offensive. Music. So viewers ended up with odd hybrid cuts that no longer matched the theatrical release. Meanwhile, the more extreme missing pieces left almost nothing behind. That gap gave fans room to imagine. Once that happens, lost footage stops feeling like ordinary deleted scenes and starts feeling like movie folklore. Even the world around the film developed its own ghosts. One of the strangest was the Blazing Saddles television spin-off that nearly existed, music, and then disappeared. CBS and Warner Brothers tried to turn the film into a network sitcom called Black Bart. A pilot was shot with Louis Gossett Jr. playing the sheriff. The project was completed, delivered, and then quietly shelved. 4 years, most people had no idea it existed at all. Later, home video releases finally brought it back into view, but by then it already had music, the shape of a buried relic. It felt less like a failed series and more like another strange branch in the movie's haunted history. Then there are the tiny half-remembered jokes that somehow music became legends of their own. One example is the line often quoted as, "You're sucking on my arm." People have repeated that story for years because it sits music right at the edge of what even Blazing Saddles was willing to keep. The line reportedly came out of on-set riffing during one of the film's chaotic scenes, and versions of the moment may have existed during editing. By the time the movie reached theaters, it was gone. What stayed behind was the story. That is enough. Sometimes a joke does not even need to survive on screen to become part of a film's reputation. It only needs to be remembered, repeated, and passed along with a little disbelief. That is why this missing line still matters. Years later, Mel Brooks described it as the one joke in Blazing Saddles that made him stop and think he had gone a little too far. That detail gives the line real power. This is a movie famous for pushing every boundary it could find. It attacks racism head-on. It throws slurs right in the audience's face. It keeps going when most studio comedies would pull back. Yet even here, Brooks found one moment that crossed his own comfort line. That makes the missing joke feel like a pressure point music in the whole story of the film. It also reveals something about the culture of the time. Blazing Saddles arrived in 1974 when Hollywood was already testing limits, but still faced real fear around sexual material in mainstream comedy. Brooks had support in handling the film's racial satire because the movie had the voice and force of artists like Richard Pryor and Cleavon Little behind it. Even so, a more explicit music sexual punchline carried a different kind of risk. It could invite censorship. It could stir theater backlash. It could shift the balance of the scene in a way Brooks did not want, so he cut it. That choice may have made the scene stronger. In the finished version, the setup already tells the audience where the joke is going. The room goes dark. The performance does the rest. Sound, timing, and suggestion all pull viewers toward the same conclusion. By removing the line that would have made the moment explicit, Brooks left the audience alone with the idea that often works better in comedy. People fill in the blank for themselves, and what they imagine can feel sharper than anything spoken out loud. The joke became dirtier because it was not fully explained. That is also why younger viewers usually discover the line outside the movie itself. They do not hear it while watching Blazing Saddles. They find it later through interviews, trivia pages, video essays, and long articles about the film's limits. Brooks retelling the story on television helped turn it into modern lore. Once that happened, the line gained a strange status. It was not part of the released movie. Yet, it started to feel central to the movie's identity. People repeated it as proof that even Blazing Saddles had a point where it paused. In a way, that missing joke became a shortcut to the whole film. It captures the tug-of-war between freedom and restraint, between wild invention and final judgment. Brooks fought the studio over what the movie should be. And at the same time, he made his own cuts when his instinct told him a moment had gone far enough. That is what makes the film so interesting. Even now it was not shaped by one clean rule. It was shaped by pressure from every side, then held together by feel. Over the years, media coverage only made that story bigger. One interview led to articles. Articles led to retrospectives. Music. Retrospectives turned the deleted line into a kind of secret crown jewel of Blazing Saddles lore. At the same time, the movie's actual spoken quotes kept living their own loud lives. Fans still repeat the lines they can hear and recite. Those are the lines that made audiences roar in 1974 and still spread through posters, clips, and memes. Yet, the missing arm joke now sits beside them in a different way. It is famous not because audiences heard it, but because they did not. It became a legend through absence rather than presence. That strange reputation says a great deal about how people remember movies. Sometimes what gets cut becomes just as fascinating as what remains. In the case of Blazing Saddles, the deleted joke represents more than one missing punchline. It stands as evidence that even a filmmaker famous for pushing every boundary still had a personal limit. Mel Brooks challenged censorship, fought studio executives, defended controversial satire, and refused to water down the movie's central ideas. Yet, when faced with one bedroom joke that felt just a little too explicit, he trusted his instincts and removed it. That decision became one of the most revealing moments in the film's history. It reminds audiences that creative freedom is not simply about refusing every restriction. Sometimes it also means knowing when a joke serves the story and when it distracts from it. Brooks believed Blazing Saddles worked better without that line, and history suggests he may have been right. The film remains one of the boldest and most influential comedies ever made, not because every joke survived, but because the ones that remained worked together with remarkable precision. In the end, the legend of the missing line has become part of Blazing Saddles itself. It lives through interviews, documentaries, fan discussions, trivia collections, and video essays rather than the finished movie. People continue debating whether they would have laughed, whether Brooks made the right choice, and whether the joke would still work today. Those conversations keep the story alive decades after the film first reached theaters. Ironically, the line that audiences never heard became one of the movie's most famous stories, proving that sometimes what is left out can become just as unforgettable as what stays in. One interview led to articles. Articles led to retrospectives. Music. Retrospectives turned the deleted line into a kind of secret crown jewel of Blazing Saddles lore. At the same time, the movie's actual spoken quotes kept living their own loud lives. Fans still repeat the lines they can hear and recite. Those are the lines that made audiences roar in 1974 and still spread through posters, clips, and memes. Yet, the missing arm joke now sits beside them in a different way. It is famous not because audiences heard it, but because they did not hear it. That missing line became a symbol of everything that made Blazing Saddles such an unusual film. It represented the constant struggle between artistic freedom and restraint, between what could be shown and what worked best when left to the imagination. Brooks spent months defending controversial material, refusing to remove scenes that gave the movie its identity. But he also showed that editing was not simply about making a film shorter. It was about deciding which moments strengthened the comedy and which ones weakened it. Looking back, the missing joke has taken on a life of its own. Fans continue searching for lost footage, comparing script drafts, and discussing interviews where Brooks explained why he removed it. Whether the line would have made the movie funnier is still open to debate, but its absence has become part of the legend. In many ways, it proves one of comedy's oldest lessons. Sometimes what the audience imagines is even more powerful than what they actually see or hear. That is why the deleted line continues to fascinate viewers decades later, even though it never appeared in the final version of Blazing Saddles.